The subject of my talk is the Norman invasion of England in 1066, and today we'll explore some of the insights that may be gained by taking a novel maritime perspective when studying the texts and other sources that have come down to us regarding this pivotal event. Over the next 45 minutes, I'll briefly introduce my research topic. I'll give an overview of what we think we know about the maritime elements of the Norman invasion. I'll talk about some of the environmental changes that have taken place over the last 950 years and why they're important. I'll talk about the types of maritime knowledge and experience that are required to make a successful crossing of the English Channel, and will tell you about my periods of fieldwork, where I've sailed on reconstructed 11th century ships and made my own channel crossings in a modern sailing vessel. And finally, I'll discuss the different types of 11th century ships that may have been available to William the Conqueror and their capabilities and limitations. My doctoral research aims to provide a hitherto largely uncharted maritime context for the Norman invasion of England by looking back at the earlier 11th century in Normandy to explore where the maritime knowledge, experience and ships may have been found for Duke William to draw upon in the early months of 1066. Despite its circa 600 kilometres of English Channel coastline along the northern border of France, Normandy is not considered to be a maritime polity in this period, which falls at the end of the so-called Viking Age, a period of northern European history typified by maritime travel and connectivity. In the west, like England and Ireland, Normandy was settled in the late 9th century by groups from Scandinavia, following an extended period of raiding. However, Normandy is rarely considered seriously as part of this Viking diaspora. As long ago as 1969, the eminent Norman historian Lucien Musset observed that the Viking leader Rollo's installation as Count of Rouen in the early 10th century connected the lower River Seine region to the vast economic space of the narrow seas of the north that was roamed by the Vikings from the waters of Ireland to the rivers of Eastern Europe. Although the maritime networks of the Viking Age have been researched in detail, Normandy has generally been excluded from these studies due to the evidence that the early Normans quickly integrated into Carolingian society and adopted both Christianity and Frankish administrative systems. It's therefore been assumed that by the 11th century, Normandy looked to the continent rather than to the North Sea world, and its involvement in these maritime networks was limited to cross-channel trade between Rouen and London, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's implication that Viking fleets were using Norman ports as bases from which to make attacks on England around the turn of the first millennium. From this position, the Norman cross-channel invasion of 1066 seems to appear out of nowhere. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 is the most famous date in English history, and as a result, the story of the Norman conquest is well known, or at least certain aspects are, that in January 1066, Edward the Confessor died without a direct heir, and as Earl of Wessex, Harold Godwinson, became King of England. Then, in autumn of that year, there were two invasions of England, one from Norway and one from Normandy, with three major battles: Fulford, Stamford Bridge, and Hastings. The outcome of the Battle of Hastings was a Norman victory, resulting in the large-scale replacement of the ruling elite and England's orientation towards the continent for arguably the next 950 years. Certain aspects of this narrative have consistently received more attention than others, resulting in a conspicuous gap in our knowledge regarding how Duke William was able to assemble a fleet suitable to transport an army of perhaps around 7,000 men and 2,000 horses, plus an array of supporting personnel and provisions, and successfully make the sea crossing to invade a rich and well-organised island kingdom. To date, studies of the Norman conquest have consistently adopted a terrestrial perspective, and where the Norman invasion fleet is discussed, it's generally limited to descriptions of the assembly of the invasion fleet in the estuary of the River Dives and its subsequent passage along the coast to St. Valery in the Somme estuary, primarily for the purpose of progressing the narrative on to the Battle of Hastings. And yet, the maritime nature of the Norman invasion has always been one of the most significant features of this pivotal event, as reflected in the Bayeux Tapestry, where 13% of the total extant length depicts the construction, embarkation, crossing and landing of the Norman fleet. I suggest that exploring both the sources for the Norman invasion from a maritime perspective that centres the knowledge and expertise required for the cross-channel enterprise, as well as Normandy's earlier 11th century history, it is possible to identify where the knowledge, skills, experience, competence, and even ships may have been found in 1066. When Normandy's earlier 11th century history is reconsidered from a non-terrestrial point of view, it becomes apparent that, despite being overlooked as a maritime polity, there is a variety of evidence that points to an active maritime tradition in Normandy in the years immediately preceding 1066. This includes a wide maritime vocabulary, large and prosperous fishing and whaling fleets, valuable cross-channel trade, and a wide array of texts that draw attention to the place of maritime experience and knowledge in the Norman people's cultural memory in this period. Significantly, the Norman invasion in 1066 was also the second attempted cross-channel invasion of England by the Normans that century, indicating the availability of knowledge, resources, and personnel across at least 2 generations. Having identified this maritime theme within many of the 11th century texts concerning both the 1066 Norman invasion specifically, and the histories written by and for the Normans in this period, I went on to explore what kinds of maritime knowledge would have been required. To do this, I adopted a multidisciplinary approach, drawing on my own background in archaeology and environmental science. This included exploring the changes that have occurred to the Norman rivers and coasts over the last 950 years. By understanding the types and likely extent of environmental change during the last millennium, it is possible to reconstruct more accurately the seascapes familiar to 11th century mariners, and therefore to more fully appreciate their concerns and considerations while navigating this area. For example, the top image on this slide is part of a map from 1750 that shows the estuary of the River Seine prior to the extensive modifications that took place from the 1840s onwards and that are still ongoing today. The bottom image is the same area of the Seine estuary today from Google Maps. This map in the top image is one of the earliest and most detailed records of the River Seine, and clearly depicts the morphology of the river before major works began to attempt to control it, which included narrowing and deepening the main channel, raising the banks and reducing the floodplain to reclaim the intertidal zone. This map also clearly demonstrates the extent of the hazards to navigation that the engineering project sought to remedy. These works removed many of the islands in the River Seine through dredging, or by connecting them to the land at the banks, which greatly improved the navigability of the river. In 1750, there were 117 islands in the lower River Seine, but today there are only 20, and they are mainly located in a short stretch between Oiselle and Rouen, which is around 125 to 135 kilometres upriver from the sea. The fact that today there are still sandbanks in the mouth of the Seine estuary that are hazards to navigation, despite ongoing management strategies for almost 200 years, demonstrates the extent of this problem in the past. It's important to emphasise, however, that the estuary of the River Seine was not unchanged from prehistory until the recalibration works of the 19th century. And in contrast, we know that the high sediment load of the river created shifting channels, sandbanks and islands, as well as causing harbours in use during the Roman period to silter and be relocated in the early medieval period. Acknowledging and understanding these environmental changes is essential to any consideration of the historic use of this waterway, and also applies to coastal changes such as erosion and deposition that affect the way that coasts were navigated in the past. Along with geography, the other fundamental consideration for traversing the English Channel zone is the tides. Tides are and have always been of singular importance when considering any maritime voyage in the English Channel, where they are some of the strongest and most complex in the world. As this bar chart shows, the tidal range, which is the difference between low tide and high tide, is up to 12 metres in the English Channel, compared to up to around 6 metres in the North Sea, 8 metres in the Irish Sea, 1.5 metres in the Mediterranean Sea, and only 20 centimetres in the Baltic Sea. In the English Channel, this tidal range of up to 12 metres means that many harbours are inaccessible unless the tide is high or rising, and therefore knowing the state of tide at any given time and place is essential, as well as the local effects of wind and weather on these harbours, where the water level can be lower or higher depending on the direction of the wind, for example. The Baie du Mont-Saint-Michel, on Normandy's western border with Brittany, experiences this 12-metre tidal range, which at low tide exposes the sandy intertidal zone for up to 10 kilometres, and when the tide comes back in, it's said to be travelling faster than a galloping horse. As a result, it has always been of the utmost importance that sailors carefully plan their entry and exit from the bay. In a tidal environment, local knowledge is essential to avoid sandbanks and to navigate the deeper channels to avoid running aground. These are skills required for any estuarine and coastal navigation in the English Channel zone and are as true today as they were 950 years ago. So, with these considerations of geography and tide in mind, when reading the 11th and 12th century texts that mention the harbours used for cross-channel and coastal voyages in this period, we can appreciate the significance of these places within the maritime geography of 11th century Normandy. The map on this slide shows the 11th century coastal harbours identified from period sources, such as narrative texts and charters. As you can see, I've colour-coded them according to their geology, and I've highlighted that while Fécamp and Dieppe are in a rocky coastline, they are Normandy's only all-tide harbours in this period. This is extremely significant, as this means that the kind of problems we saw in the Baie du Mont-Saint-Michel, which also apply to all of those yellow sandy harbours on this map to varying degrees, are not an issue here, as there is always enough water in these two harbours for vessels to enter and exit. Unfortunately, things are never that simple though, and as well as considerations of geography and tide, the wind and weather are also determining factors concerning the accessibility of all of these harbours. For the entire Normandy coast, they are very dangerous to attempt to enter or exit if the wind is coming from a northerly direction. Due to the limited number of havens in Upper Normandy, the two that were accessible to ships on any state of tide would have been extremely valuable and strategically significant from the point of view of maritime communication, trade and defence. It's certainly not a coincidence, therefore, that, as Lucien Musset highlights, Dieppe was always included among the ports in ducal and, following the Norman conquest, royal control, as it was the closest Norman all-tide harbour to the shores of southeast England. The other, Fécamp, was in the control of the Abbey of Fécamp, which enjoyed a close association with the Dukes of Normandy, and the Abbey's involvement in various maritime activities throughout the 11th century are numerous and significant. The underlying geologies of the three coastal areas of Normandy are very different, which has important implications regarding the configurations of the coastlines and considerations regarding their navigability, so I will briefly introduce each in turn. Manche, in the far west of Normandy, accounts for approximately half of Normandy's coastline. However, the geology here has created a more erratic and rugged coastline than other parts of Normandy. And while the many small coves provide havens for local fishing fleets, there are very few large harbours, and the numerous headlands and rocky outcrops cause challenging inshore conditions around much of the Manche coastline. An example of this can be seen in the lower left-hand image of the approach to Saint-Malo, just over the Norman border into Brittany, where at low tide hundreds of rocks are visible, but at high tide the majority are hidden just below the surface. In the 11th century, there were four main harbours for the circa 300 kilometres of the coastline of Manche, and three of those were located on the north and northeastern tip of the peninsula due to the prevailing southwesterly winds that made any harbour on the western seaboard extremely exposed. All four of these harbours in Manche were ducal possessions in the 11th century, again, like Dieppe, demonstrating the ducal interest in controlling these strategically significant coastal sites on Normandy's far western border. Approximately 130 kilometres of Normandy's coastline is known as the Alabaster Coast, which is an almost solid wall of high chalk cliffs that run along the coast of Seine-Maritime from Le Havre, which is near Harfleur on the map, to Le Tréport on Normandy's northeastern border. These limestone cliffs mirror those of the White Cliffs of Dover in southeast England, but cover 10 times the distance, creating a formidable wall along a large part of Normandy's English Channel coastline, as you can see from the bottom left image. On average, the cliffs of the Alabaster Coast are 70 metres high, with the highest point at Cap Fadnier above Fécamp, which is 110 metres high. The bottom right image is a picture I took in May 2023 and shows the result of a major cliff fall at Cap Fadnier in February last year. The whole coastline of Seine-Maritime is, and has always been, prone to erosion, though the rates of coastal change in different sections of the cliffs have recently been modelled and have demonstrated a great deal of spatial variability due to the geological composition of the chalk, as well as the effects of modern coastal management strategies that have affected natural erosion patterns. While we don't know precisely what the coastline of Seine-Maritime looked like in the 11th century, we do know which sections eroded at a faster rate than others, and early maps indicate the presence of headlands that have been smoothed out over the last 500 years, indicating a process that would have continued back to the 11th century and beyond. Today, the Alabaster Coast has 5 main harbours, located in gaps in the cliffs. These are Le Havre, Fécamp, Saint-Valery-en-Caux, Dieppe and Le Tréport. However, Le Havre wasn't established until the 16th century, and while Saint-Valery-en-Caux and Le Tréport were important harbours in the 11th century, as I mentioned previously, Dieppe and Fécamp are Normandy's only all-tide harbours in this period, which gave them particular significance, especially along this formidable coastline with few havens. This is a subject I will return to later when I'll talk about the first-hand experience I gained when sailing along this coastline during my fieldwork last year. In contrast to the rocky coastlines of Manche and Seine-Maritime, the approximately 120 kilometres of the coastline of Calvados is typified by long sandy beaches at the foot of low cliffs. While on first appearance this map indicates that there were several harbours in this region during the 11th century, this entire coastline is subject to significant sedimentation, so they would all have been extremely sandy and shallow. Additionally, most of these harbours offered very little shelter, so they were very exposed to wind and weather conditions in the English Channel. As a result, all of these harbours have been augmented to varying degrees in recent centuries to attempt to overcome these issues, so today they bear little resemblance to how they would have been in the 11th century. However, while sedimentation was certainly still an issue, some of these harbours offered more favourable conditions. For example, Honfleur and Harfleur were located just inside the Seine estuary and therefore offered more protection from adverse weather conditions, and Port-en-Bessin and Dives-sur-Mer can both be classified as natural harbours due to their local geography. Port-en-Bessin was a small, shallow harbour situated in a valley between 2 cliffs, and for this stretch of coast it was relatively well protected. However, we know from the 17th century records of attempts to maximise the utility of this harbour that the sedimentation was severe and couldn't be mitigated until advances in technology from the 19th century onwards. Nonetheless, in the 11th century and possibly earlier, Port-en-Bessin was a possession of the bishops of Bayeux. The bishopric of Bayeux was the most important religious establishment in this region during the 11th century, and was held from the year 1011 until 1097 by members of the ducal family, including Bishop Odo de Contville, the half-brother of William the Conqueror. It's therefore significant that, as with Fécamp, we find one of the most convenient harbours in this area in the hands of the most important local religious institution that had close and long-lasting associations with the ducal family. Finally, on to Dives-sur-Mer, the location of the initial assembly of the Norman invasion fleet in 1066, according to William of Poitiers and Audric Vitalis, who were writing in the late 11th and early 12th centuries respectively. Like the other harbours along the Calvados coastline, Dives-sur-Mer was shallow, silty and tidal, with a large number of sandbanks, both in the river mouth and immediately offshore. However, the main benefit of Dives-sur-Mer is that there's a low but significant sandy spit most of the way across the mouth of the River Dives that offered protection from the worst of the waves, wind and weather. Nonetheless, this harbour would have had challenging navigational conditions, and that is still the case today. An example is depicted in the bottom left-hand image, which shows the approach to Dives-sur-Mer at mid-tide. At low tide, there can be as little as 40 centimetres of tide here, which means that for a large part of the day, the banks of sediment are either exposed or are barely covered by water. This image also shows the main channel, which is the naturally deeper route. Today, river channels flowing to the sea along this coast are often manually augmented by dredging, but in the past they would have been prone to shift according to the deposition of the sediment and required local knowledge of the safe route through. The Dives estuary is almost unrecognisable today compared to how it was in the 11th century, as from its refoundation in the 1050s, Benedictine monks from the Abbey of Saint-Martin-Troan began the process of draining the wetlands and encouraging the development of meadows, which in turn sped up the process of silting the valley floor. Today, the landscape is primarily agricultural pasture as a result of this long-term project of draining the marsh, with significant progress made during the 17th century, though it is still ongoing, as can be seen in the drainage ditches on the edge of the meadows today. In the 11th century, this entire area was intertidal salt marsh, and the contemporary chronicler William of Poitiers records that Duke William initially assembled his force here when he states that unfavourable winds delayed Duke William for a month at the mouth of the Dives. There has been a great deal of scholarly debate over the possible reality of this statement concerning these unfavourable winds, and particularly around whether it was rather an excuse for the Normans to delay their invasion until the English defences on the south coast had been stood down. In the English Channel, the prevailing winds are generally southwesterly, indicating the direction that they come from. Though unlike the predictable tides, the weather is extremely changeable, and in reality the wind can and does come from any direction, but southwesterly winds are generally the most common. The mouth of the Dives estuary and the entire northern coastline of Normandy is subject to rough sea conditions if the wind is coming from any compass bearing ranging from west-northwest through northeast, even in a moderate breeze. The effects of these conditions, as experienced by sailors today, align closely with the 11th century narrative accounts of Duke William's fleet being pinned in port. As well as William of Poitiers, another contemporary writer, Guy of Amiens, describes this situation, again with reference to the wind and sea conditions. Guy states that, quote, "For a long time tempest and continuous rain prevented your fleet from sailing across the channel. While you waited for a favourable wind, the rough sea compelled you to turn back, and the east wind curled the ocean's waves with its blasts. You were in despair when all hope of sailing was denied you." End quote. Although Guy doesn't mention Dives-sur-Mer by name, his description of the rough seas that forced Duke William to turn back certainly conform to the effects of these wind and weather conditions in the mouth of the River Dives today. William of Poitiers and Audric Vitalis explicitly named Dives-sur-Mer as the original embarkation point for the Norman invasion fleet. Both of these writers, and many others, agree that the fleet eventually crossed the English Channel to England from Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, which in the 11th century lay beyond the border of Normandy in the county of Ponthieu. As with the references to unfavourable winds, there's been much scholarly debate around whether the Norman invasion fleet intended to travel approximately 170 kilometres along the coast from Dives-sur-Mer to Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, or whether, as the narrative accounts assert, the fleet was, quote, "blown from the mouth of the Dives and the neighbouring ports, where they had long waited for a south wind to carry them across, and was driven by the breath of the west wind to moorings at Saint-Valery." End quote. The principal observation I have about this voyage, and particularly having now sailed it myself, is that this is a huge distance to travel for it not to be the final destination. The passage along the coast from Dives to Saint-Valery may have taken around 20 hours of non-stop sailing time, or indeed much longer, as is often the case with sailing vessels, that are subject to the vagaries of the wind, weather, tide and currents, not to mention attempting to travel as a fleet. That's a long time to be at sea in an open boat, especially with all the logistical arrangements needed for the loading of so many ships and sailing according to the tides, not to mention the shipment of potentially 2,000 horses. That's a lot of logistics, as well as very real dangers, to attempt to manage or to just contend with. And based on scholarly studies of Duke William's biography and military strategies employed throughout the years preceding this venture, it doesn't appear to be a manoeuvre that such a demonstrably patient and calculating individual would attempt to risk as a two-part endeavour. It's also worth pointing out that it's a similar distance to sail along the Norman coast from Dives to St. Valery as it is crossing straight from Dives to the Solent and the vicinity of Portsmouth Harbour. If you then add the additional perhaps 12 hours to cross from St. Valery to Pevensey, that is a long time to choose to be at sea, where so much is outside of anyone's control. There's no indication from any of the sources that the fleet stopped at a harbour between Dives-sur-Mer and St. Valery-sur-Somme, and as we've seen, there are very few harbours available along the coast of Seine-Maritime. Although there are the two all-tide harbours of Fécamp and Dieppe, attempting to organise entry into these harbours for a huge fleet would be an extremely complicated manoeuvre, requiring clear communication and organisation, as well as daylight, which if the fleet had been blown along this coast unintentionally, would have been all but impossible in those circumstances. We also hear from William of Poitiers that during this passage along the coast from Dives-sur-Mer to St. Valery, there were both shipwrecks and, quote, the craven flight of many who had pledged their faith to him, that is, Duke William, end quote. This arguably demonstrates both the dangers of attempting to enter the Seine-Maritime harbours in unfavourable conditions, and that some of the ships in the fleet nonetheless did succeed in abandoning the venture by entering harbours along the route. It's at this point that I want to introduce the periods of fieldwork I've undertaken over the last 2 years, both at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, Denmark, and sailing the route you can see here, which follows that of the Norman invasion fleet in 1066 that I've been discussing. For 9 days in May 2023, I sailed approximately 364 nautical miles around the English Channel, spending over 65 hours at sea, in calm weather and storms and in daylight and darkness, to research the seascapes of the Norman invasion of England in 1066. The aim of this period of fieldwork was to experience the maritime environments associated with the Norman invasion, to gain insights into the practical considerations of maritime travel in this area. This experience has given me a different perspective on the 11th and 12th century texts that discuss maritime travel and were, in many cases, written by people who had made channel crossings themselves, so I can consider the place of this lived experience among the range of influences on the historical writing of the period. Additionally, this first-hand environmental experience, along with my own desk-based studies of the coastal changes I've already discussed, mean that I now have greater insight into the practicalities, challenges, and considerations of this undertaking. It's worth clarifying that although the route I generally followed was that of the Norman invasion fleet in 1066, as recorded in the narrative accounts, I was not trying to recreate this voyage. So I was in a modern yacht, which enabled me to record data accurately and regularly. I had to abide by modern border force requirements, which is why you can see on this map that the first port of call in Normandy was Ouistreham and not Dives-sur-Mer. And I did stop along the coast of Seine-Maritime at both Fécamp and Dieppe. I also embarked from Gosport in Portsmouth Harbour, as I think this was in the vicinity of the original intended destination of the Norman invasion fleet, where the objective would likely have then been to continue to Winchester, an important royal and ecclesiastical centre in the 11th century. I have a lot of data from my sailing fieldwork that I'm still analysing and thinking about, but there is one particular aspect that I would like to share with you today. That is the importance of sea marks, which are features in the environment that can be used for navigation. This fieldwork has really emphasised to me the importance of familiarity with this coastline, to identify the few accessible harbours and to orient yourself in such a monotonous seascape where the chalk cliffs provide extremely limited points of reference. Both William of Poitiers and Guy of Amiens indicate that the fleet experienced changeable winds that would have simultaneously made it very difficult to cross to southern England and very dangerous to get into the few available harbours in Upper Normandy. In contrast, the Somme estuary is a vast open expanse of intertidal marsh and sandbanks with plenty of space for a large fleet. In the conditions that we are told the Norman fleet experienced, especially in the dark and along this long coastline where the cliffs are a solid, inhospitable wall, I can understand the rationale for continuing along the coast of the huge Somme estuary, which is very obvious from the sea, as it's located at the point where the Norman cliffs drop away abruptly into the wide, flat landscape of the estuary. Hopefully you can see the cliffs dropping away to the left in this image. When I was sailing, it was really obvious, even in relatively poor visibility, that the cliffs disappeared quite abruptly when they had been a constant companion for 130 kilometres and about 20 hours of sailing time. This would be a clear maritime sea mark, providing orientation and the reassurance that shortly the fleet would be sailing past the vast Somme estuary, which would allow the entire fleet to escape the open sea as a complete flotilla. Having now sailed this stretch of coastline, I can see why a large fleet might prioritise staying together in safety and could have ended up in the Somme estuary, even though it may have been possible for some individual ships to gain access to Norman harbours along the way. At the point where the ships were blown off course to the northeast, unable to make the channel crossing, experienced captains would have known that the Somme estuary was the only viable option if the fleet were to stay together, and would therefore potentially have required no additional attempts at communication between the ships during the passage, which the sources indicate was made in a state of some disorganisation. Still on the subject of sea marks for maritime navigation, Beachy Head is a headland on the south coast of England to the west of Pevensey Bay, where it's recorded that the Norman invasion fleet made landfall after leaving St. Valery. I made the same crossing to Pevensey Bay in good conditions and, as you can see, Beachy Head was a clear sea mark. In this crossing, which is in a narrower area of the channel, I only lost sight of land for 1.5 hours of the 11-hour crossing, as for most of the journey the coast around Boulogne, near Calais, was visible, and then shortly after losing sight of that coast, Beachy Head came into view, which acted as a guide along with the Fairley headland to the east of Pevensey Bay. These two headlands wrap like arms around Pevensey Bay, guiding vessels in, as the following video hopefully shows. These clear sea marks would have assisted the majority of the fleet to be in the correct part of the channel for the entry into Pevensey Bay, though William of Poitiers does record that some ships landed at Romney further to the east by mistake, possibly indicating that the west wind continued to at least some extent throughout the autumn. Moving back to the Norman coast and the Seine estuary, cliff-top churches and shrines are attested as sea marks in later periods, so I'm interested in whether La Chapelle Notre-Dame de Grâce at Honfleur, at the mouth of the River Seine, may have fulfilled this role to direct ships onto the beach directly below to avoid the fast currents and large sandbanks further into the River Seine, where the modern and later medieval harbour of Honfleur is located. Interestingly, in the 19th century, a lighthouse was built at the base of this cliff, not to direct ships into the port of Honfleur, but instead to guide them safely past a very large sandbank in the mouth of the estuary. Local folklore records that the precursor to this chapel was built by Duke Richard II of Normandy before the year 1023, in thanks for his salvation from a shipwreck, as commemorated in this stained glass window. This is pertinent to my research in identifying evidence for Norman maritime activity earlier in the 11th century. The plaque records that the current chapel was built between 1600 and 1615 to replace the original, which was lost during a coastal landslide in the 16th century in the vicinity of the top left image, where the outlook is across the Seine estuary to Le Havre and out into the English Channel. Finally, I would like to briefly discuss how all the different environmental and geographical elements that I've been talking about today are only one part of the analyses required when exploring the possible lived experience of 11th century mariners in the English Channel zone. Other fundamental areas of analysis are the ships themselves, and specifically their capabilities and limitations. It's important to acknowledge here that this is not a new revelation, as in the 1980s and early 1990s, a group of scholars published a series of articles considering the perceived realities of an autumn channel crossing in square-rigged, shallow-draft vessels that stimulated debates around the assumed seagoing capabilities of 11th century ships. While some effort went into computing 11th century resource requirements, proposed passage plans, and tidal conditions, the limitations of the technology of the late 20th century, and indeed the conjectural nature of the numbers of soldiers and ships involved in the Norman invasion of 1066, has severely restricted the application of the findings from these studies. Nonetheless, despite their limitations, at the time, these scholars inspired conversations about the subject that it's now timely to revisit, as modern research and technology enable far greater accuracy and insight into the sorts of projections and discussions with which these studies were concerned. These modern advances include the extremely accurate historic tidal calculations that can now be computed by the UK Hydrographic Office, and the decades-long experimental archaeological research undertaken by the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, Denmark. The Viking Ship Museum is home to the 5 11th century ships excavated near Skudelev in Roskilde Fjord in 1962, which have all been dated to around 1030 to 1040 AD. For 60 years since the excavation of the Skudelev ships, the Viking Ship Museum has conserved and studied these vessels, and since the 1980s has also reconstructed and regularly sailed them. There is, therefore, a huge repository of data held by the Viking Ship Museum and by the volunteers in the museum's ship guilds who crew the reconstructions on different aspects of the ship's sailing capabilities and social organisation on board. This is the experience that I drew on during my 2 periods of fieldwork at the Viking Ship Museum in May 2022 and in June 2023, where I sailed on all of the reconstructed ships active at that time. There are no complete ship finds from 11th century Normandy or England, so the Skudelev ships offer an insight into the types of vessels in use in the English Channel in this period, and are therefore probably representative of the types of ships that may have been available for the Norman invasion of England in 1066. I will now introduce the 5 Skudelev ships and will talk a little bit about their capabilities and limitations in relation to the possible 11th century environments of Normandy. Skudelev 1 is an ocean-going cargo ship of around 26 tons. We know that much larger cargo vessels were also operating in this period, as Wreck 3 from Hedeby is a cargo ship of around 60 tons. Skudelev 1 is primarily a sailing ship, with only 4 oars to help with fine manoeuvring. There is a cargo area amidships, so the crew in the fore and aft are separated during sailings, which has implications for communication. With only a small crew, this reconstruction is spacious and comfortable compared to the other vessels. Due to its weight and relatively deep draft, the Skudelev 1 reconstruction is very stable, and the effects of the movement of live cargo, such as animals or people, would have had a reduced effect on the sailing ability of this type of ship. However, these same traits would make it limited to transiting the tidal harbours of Lower Normandy, including the Dives estuary, on a rising mid to high tide to avoid running aground. Additionally, for the harbours of Dives-sur-Mer and Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, navigating the deep water channels, avoiding the sandbanks, and avoiding hundreds of other ships are also key considerations for how this type of vessel, that had few oars and limited manoeuvrability, may have operated in these environments. Skudlev II is a typical longship that many people might imagine when the term Viking ship is mentioned. It's long and narrow, which makes it a very effective sailing and rowing vessel with maximum recorded speeds of 14 knots, which is roughly 16 miles an hour. The average speed is around 6 to 8 knots, or around 7 to 9 miles per hour. While it's both a rowing and sailing ship, it is, however, likely that this type of ship was sailed whenever possible, with rowing reserved for relatively short periods and particularly for entering and exiting harbours. It wouldn't have been possible for the crew to have rowed for around 10 hours or more across the English Channel. While the long, narrow and shallow structure of this type of vessel gives it excellent sailing capabilities for the period, these same characteristics make it essential that weight is appropriately distributed, that every person on board is in the right place and not only has a practical role to fulfill, but that, due to the length and huge sail blocking much of the view around the ship, they know what to do at exactly the right time. The main thing that I took away from the experience of sailing on the reconstruction of Skudlev II and my conversations with the regular crew is that this is not a ship crewed by amateurs or that could accommodate a large number of passengers. This is a key consideration for the practicalities of the Norman invasion in 1066 and may call into question either the depictions of the Norman invasion fleet as made up almost entirely of this type of vessel in the popular and scholarly imagination, or the extent of the maritime skill sets possessed by the combatants that Duke William took with him across the Channel, or indeed both. Skudlev III is a coastal trader that could have held around 4 tons of cargo and is the best preserved of the Skudlev ships. The first reconstruction built by the Viking Ship Museum was of Skudlev III, but after 32 years that ship was retired and in 2022 a new reconstruction was launched. A lot had been learned in the intervening period, and consequently the hull shape on the new reconstruction has been adapted to more closely reflect the original surviving timbers. While Skudlev III is a coastal trader, meaning it's not well adapted to the open sea, the original reconstruction nonetheless sailed to Poland, Gotland and France, as well as around what were likely to have been the ship's original home waters of Denmark. This is a ship type that is likely to have been seen along the coasts of the English Channel and could have made channel crossings. Due to its much smaller size than Skudlev I or Hedeby III, this vessel type would have been more manoeuvrable and would have had similar tidal requirements to Skudlev II due to their similar draft. However, it would have been more susceptible to sudden shifts in weight distribution than the larger cargo vessels. Skudlev V is a particularly interesting ship for my research, as it's the only one of the Skudlev ships with evidence that it's been constructed using recycled timbers, as well as new timbers. This is an important consideration to keep in mind, as many of the early documentary sources for the Norman invasion state that ships were built, but the resource and labour requirements are huge, so the example of Skudlev V is a thought-provoking possible alternative to the idea that completely new ships were constructed, and instead old ships may have been brought back into service or existing ships were adapted to serve new purposes. Like Skudlev II, this is a ship with little or no additional space for passengers and requires the crew to be distributed appropriately and to carry out their roles precisely and immediately to ensure the stability of the vessel. Finally, Skudlev VI is a fishing vessel built in western Norway. This is a significant detail, as when the first reconstruction was built, the stem, which was missing from the original, was constructed according to Danish boat-building traditions. However, this ship was challenging to sail even in relatively mild conditions and wasn't performing as the boat builders anticipated. Therefore, a second reconstruction was built that instead reflected Norwegian boat-building traditions, as you can see from the top picture where the stems of the two ships differ, with the Danish stem design at the background and the Norwegian stem design in the foreground. This is an important consideration regarding the limitations of using these experimental archaeological reconstructions to suggest what different vessel types may have been like in Normandy, or indeed England, Ireland or Flanders during the 11th century. To conclude, as we have seen, the coastline of Normandy is not homogeneous, and by appreciating the navigational considerations of the different regions of the coast and the sailing capabilities of reconstructed 11th century ships, it is possible to gain additional insights into the narrative accounts of voyages undertaken in these areas in the 11th century. In this talk, I've aimed to provide an overview of the approach I'm taking in my doctoral research to contextualize the Norman invasion of 1066 within a maritime environmental framework of analysis, and to demonstrate the possibilities that such an approach offers to both studies of the Norman conquest itself and also to the place of maritime connections within the post-conquest Anglo-Norman world, which had the English Channel at its centre. Due to the multidisciplinary and wide-ranging maritime considerations of the Norman invasion of 1066, I've only been able to provide an overview of aspects of my ongoing research today, but I hope you have found it interesting. Thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any questions or comments you might have.